Today is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day we commit to recognizing and honoring the experiences of Indigenous peoples, a day we wear orange shirts to acknowledge the devastating legacy of residential schools and the murder of hundreds of Indigenous children who were ripped from their homes and forced to attend these institutions that were schools in name only. It's also a day of hope and healing, and today on Cityline we are sharing our platform with Indigenous voices who are responding to the past and changing the future. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our Cityline studio is on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples that is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also want to acknowledge that some of the conversations on today's show might be triggering. If you need support, the crisis line on our screen right now is available for you 24 hours a day. Let me introduce our first panel. We have Indigenous youth leaders and activists, Theland Kinknosway and Dani Lanovette. Thank you both for joining us to share your stories. Theland, your path on becoming a youth leader and activist started at a young age, and I understand you wrote a letter to your third grade teacher suggesting an annual powwow at the school would be an excellent learning tool. So can you tell us about what inspired you at the tender age of 8?
Yeah, what inspired me to start an annual powwow at my school began in my third grade persuasive writing unit with an idea. So each student was asked to write a letter to a teacher or the principal explaining why we should have something and persuade them to take action on it. Other kids were writing that we should have soccer balls at recess or class pet, but I wanted something else. I wrote to my principal saying it would be a great idea for other students to have a chance to see the beauty of my culture through dance and song. And not even 2 weeks later, I got a letter back saying, let's do this.
I love it. See, you had the idea, you went for it, it was executed, it happened. So this is a big, what I'm about to say is a big deal, and I think that it says a lot. You were the first generation in your family to be raised by your parents. So can you tell us what that means to you and how that has influenced your journey in activism?
So my mother was part of the 60s scoop, and my father was a part of the day school era, which means they both were separated from their families at a very young age. They weren't raised in their own home or with their culture or the understanding of what it meant to be First Nations. And I'm grateful to have been raised with both my parents, with strong community ties and knowledge that has been passed down from our ancestors. One thing I know for sure is I'm proud of my heritage and where I come from. And everything I do is to make them proud. I believe it's the responsibility of the new generation to understand the past and carry it to future generations in a good way.
See, as a parent, I love to hear that. That is a beautiful thing. Dani, I want to welcome you as well into the conversation. I want to talk to you about mental health. There is an overwhelming number of stats that show the suicide rate among First Nations people is 3 times higher than in non-Indigenous people. And suicide rates were highest for youth and young adults aged 15 to 24 years old. Having struggled yourself as a teenager with depression, actually as a tween, can you shed some light on why you think it's so pervasive within the community? And then maybe tell us a bit about the moment that things changed for you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. My name is Dani. I come from Chippewas of Nawash and Ceded First Nation and Algonquins of Barrier Lake. I grew up in Ottawa, and when I was about 11, I started showing really intense signs of depression. And it got to the point where one of my teachers ended up calling my mom in, and we had a little meeting after school, and I was recommended to go to therapy. However, it persisted on, and I think only this past March I started feeling like I wasn't actually in that depression anymore. So it's been about 13 years. It's been a really intense past 13 years, dealing with it, finding different ways that help and different coping mechanisms that are healthy. But I think so much of it has to do with the assimilation and genocide that has taken place here on Turtle Island. I know for me, my grandma was a residential school survivor and she passed before I was born, but the legacy that left on our family continues to affect us today. And so I look at my first cousins and my brother and how we're all affected by it in different ways. A lot of it is language loss. For me, it was a really deep, a really deep wanting to know who I am and where I come from. And so I started reconnecting with my communities, reconnecting with my culture around 14, 15, and started making the journey to learn my language, which is always going to be a lifelong journey, I think. But I think a lot of it just has to do with the lack of support and lack of access, especially within Northern Indigenous communities, to mental health resources, even basic things like clean water, food and accessibility, education, things like that, I think plays a huge role in why there's such a high rate of mental illness within our communities.
Theland, I'm gonna go back to you now for a moment because, you know, I'm stuck on that whole everything I do is to make my parents proud. I think that's a beautiful thing. So can you just get into why this is so crucial for you?
It's very crucial to make them proud. And what I mean by that is that they went through pain and trauma, and no child deserves to go through what they and thousands of other children have experienced. I believe it's my turn to show them that we are able to grow with our past and learn from it. It's our turn to carry on the culture of our ancestors and teach the younger generations what Indigenous strength is all about.
All right. Dani, you talk about the fact that there is a generation of Indigenous youth now that are even more aware than ever of their past and their culture. Why do you think that's happening now? And how are these Indigenous youth, including you and Theland, how are you all changing the future?
I think a lot of it has to do with how we were raised in a world that is so changing. Theland and I, you know, we have been part of protests and actions and organizing since we were babies. Theland's actually my younger cousin. So we were raised by a generation of folks who wanted to see change. And now that we have more access to it, it's our responsibility to enact that change. We're born with so many more rights than our parents and grandparents were. And so I think now that we have the ability, we're like, oh, we got to do this now. Like we have to start organizing. We have to start taking action, or else what is there going to be for our kids one day?
That's right. It's happening. It's happening. I just have one last question that I'd love for Theland to answer. Give a message now to youth that might be, Indigenous youth that might be watching this, and they're eager to learn and they're eager to support their community. What advice can you give?
I think what you can do is learn about who you are and where you come from, your culture, your family, and the past. When you arm yourself with the knowledge that has been passed down, then we are continuing the pride we all have as Indigenous peoples. I think it's important we all understand we are the new wave of Indigenous youth leading in many different spaces. Remember, we are not outlawed anymore, and our voice is a tool that needs to be nurtured for generations to come. Keep on standing up.
Beautiful words. Beautiful, both of you. Thank you so much for contributing to this conversation, Theland and Dani. So good to see you out there in the activism. I love it. We're here for it.